Good evening and welcome to the 2011 Reading Project Faculty Lecture. I've had the pleasure of meeting many of our first-year students over the past 2 days. For those of you I have not yet met, I'm James McLaren. I'm Dean of Newcomb-Tulane College, the undergraduate college. After the chaos of move-in, this lecture gives us a chance to come together as a class and begin a journey of learning that will span the next 4 years. Since 2002, the Tulane Reading Project has created a shared intellectual experience for the incoming first-year class through the reading and discussion of a common book. This year, that book is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. You should all have received a copy at June orientation or in the mail if you are unable to visit campus during our summer orientations. And I do hope that by now you've had a chance to read it. Tonight's lecture begins a semester-long series of events that will explore the themes addressed in the book, from medical ethics to race and poverty in America. These events include a visit from Johns Hopkins bioethicist Dr. Ruth Faden on October the 4th, a film series that includes such selections as the BBC documentary that figures heavily in Skloot's book, and a medical ethics panel in November. Details about all of these events and also about the essay contest that awards up to $500 are available at tulane.edu/reading. Our featured speaker today is one of our most beloved faculty members here at Tulane. Dr. Michael Cunningham is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the African and African Diaspora Studies program. He is also the first director of CELT, the Center for Engaged Learning and Teaching. In his research, he examines resilience and vulnerability in African American children and adolescents, working with New Orleans public school children to discover what allows some underprivileged youth to thrive despite the odds. Dr. Cunningham knows well that as an academic, it is sometimes challenging to build the kind of trust that facilitates a productive working relationship with the surrounding community. But at Tulane, part of our mission is to give back to the community of New Orleans. So learning to build that trust is crucial. Dr. Cunningham will address this in his talk tonight, which connects some of the issues in The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks to our public service requirement here at Tulane. And now it is a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce and welcome to you Dr. Michael Cunningham.
One cell at a time, what can I change? Is the phrase that I wanted to welcome the class of 2015 to Tulane University. Class of 2015, are you ready to make a change? Y'all ain't ready. No, you ain't ready. Class of 2015, are you ready to make a change? All right. All right. Thank you very much. You know, this is kind of daunting up here to sort of see all your bright faces. Some of you read the book, some of you didn't. I know it. I read the book. It was a fascinating read. And I thought about how to frame a talk about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. And thinking about the topics associated with the book, I remembered when I was in a similar place as you are today. I was nervous, I was excited, I was tired, anxious, and bored at listening to old people tell me how I can change the world. So I hope to ease your nervousness, increase your excitement, keep you from falling asleep because you're tired, make you feel at ease so you won't be anxious, and I hope most of all not to bore you. So how will I do that? One of the first things I heard when I got to college was, look to your left and look to your right. And one of those people won't be there when you graduate. Class of 2015, and I'm here to tell you, class of 2015, that's a bunch of crap. And I had to change my language a little bit more. If this was a smaller, intimate class, I would have said something else. So I want you to look to your left and look to your right and ask the other person, what are we going to do after graduation? Because we're going to get through Tulane. One cell at a time, figuring out what to change. That's right, because we're going to make it, right? All right. The immortal life of Henrietta Lacks brings up three things I want us to ponder today. Ethical decisions and science is an obvious topic to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is personal responsibility as scholars, researchers, and public citizens. The last thing I want to talk about is how the power of one cell can make a difference in scientific and non-scientific communities alike. In discussing these themes, I will interject personal reactions to the book, as well as interject topics of critical consideration. I'll probably leave you with more questions than I will provide more answers. So let's get to it. Theme one, the ethics associated with the book. The ethics associated with the book are obvious. How could this happen? Why didn't Johns Hopkins inform the family? What are our rights as patients? This could happen because we didn't have laws about informed consent when Mrs. Lacks' cells were first harvested for research purposes. In fact, when Henrietta Lacks was diagnosed with cervical cancer, she underwent the standard procedures. As indicated in Chapter 3, she signed a form with the words in all capital letters, Operation Permit. At the top of the page, it said, I hereby give my consent to the staff of the Johns Hopkins Hospital to perform any operative procedures under any anesthetic, either local or general, that may deem necessary in the proper surgical care and the treatment of, and it was blank. Henrietta printed her name in the blank space. A witness with illegible handwriting signed a line above that form, and Henrietta signed another. Now, Mrs. Lacks went through the standard procedures for invasive cervical cancer. She received radium treatments and other standard care that they allowed for the colored folks at the time. That's right, I said colored. Because, blacks and African Americans were referred as coloreds at that time. There were separate hospital wards, there were separate neighborhoods for the coloreds, and there were many other separate things. Yes, they were separate, but were they equal? The book brings up an ethical question. Would a person of economic privilege be treated the way Mrs. Lacks was? Would doctors do invasive procedures without consent on a poor white woman with cervical cancer? We could probably spend the entire afternoon dissecting these questions. Page 33 vividly describes the procedure. With Henrietta unconscious on the operating table in the center of the room, her feet in stirrups. The surgeon on duty, Dr. Lawrence Wharton, Jr., sat on the stool between her legs. He peered inside Henrietta, dilated her cervix, and prepared to treat her tumor. But first, though no one had told Henrietta that Tulane was collecting samples or asked if she wanted to be a donor, Wharton picked a sharp knife, shaved 2 dime-sized pieces of tissue from Henrietta's cervix, one from the tumor and one from the healthy cervical tissue nearby. Then he placed the samples in a glass dish. That sample was taken to Dr. Guy's lab. As he had done many times before, the lab didn't think anything was special about this specimen. It was one of the countless specimens that scientists and lab technicians have been trying to grow for a while, but they failed to grow for many years. So yes, this probably would have happened on many white patients, many colored patients, many patients regardless of their racial or ethnic background. But something was different about Mrs. Lacks' specimen. After Mary Kubicek, Dr. Guy's 21-year-old assistant did the standard procedures of preserving the specimen with lab techniques, including the one that she invented, and it included using chicken blood. She labeled the specimen HeLa for Henrietta Lacks on each tube and stored it in an incubator room. Little did Mary know that she was on the brink of the largest scientific discovery in history. Mary began her mornings each morning doing the standard sterilization drills with the HeLa cells. She would often laugh to herself and think, nothing's happening. Big surprise. Then, as described on page, I didn't put the page number in the book. Check your references as a rule. 2 days after Henrietta went from the hospital, Mary saw what looked like little rings of frog egg whites around the clots at the bottom of each tube. The cells were growing, but Mary didn't think anything of it. Other cells had survived for a while in the lab, but Henrietta's cells weren't merely surviving, they were growing with mythological intensity. By the next morning, they had doubled. Mary divided the contents of each tube into two, giving them room to grow. And within 24 hours, they doubled again. Soon she was dividing them into 4, and then 6. Henrietta's cells grew to fill as much space as Mary gave them. Still, God wasn't ready to celebrate. The cells could die at any moment, he told Mary. But they didn't. They kept growing like nothing anyone had seen, doubling in numbers. Every 24 hours, stacking hundreds on top of hundreds, accumulating into millions. They grew 20 times faster than Henrietta's normal cells, which died only a few days after Mary put them in the culture. As long as they had food and warmth, Henrietta's cancer cells seemed unstoppable. This was the birth of the HeLa cells revolution, where Dr. Guy only shared the cells with close colleagues. These colleagues shared them with others, and then others, and then others. Notably, one group was left out of the sharing, Mrs. Lacks' family. They did not know that Henrietta's cells were being used by many strangers. They didn't initially know that the cells were used in the most major scientific discoveries of our history. And those cells came from cancer cells from Mrs. Henrietta Lacks. The use of cells without the family's knowledge raises many ethical decisions. Some will be discussed in great detail by Dr. Ruth Faden, a professor of biomedical ethics at Johns Hopkins on October 4th. She is a very impressive scholar, and I encourage you to attend her talk too. The ethical issues raised in the book also made me think about the work we do here at Tulane. As you all know, Tulane is the only research-intensive university in the United States that requires all undergraduates to do public service. This requirement is the hallmark of our university. And we boast, only in New Orleans, only at Tulane. And I see some of you with that t-shirt on. And I really believe that only in New Orleans and only in Tulane. Only in New Orleans will you be exposed to cultures of diverse groups interacting together, such as Mardi Gras Indians, descendants of plantation and slave owners, and interacting with descendants of free people of color and former slaves. Only in New Orleans will you have the challenge of choosing which world-renowned chef's restaurant to make your parents take you to for a meal. Only in New Orleans will you get an experience at a top research institution that integrates public service with intellectual scholarships. This wonderful integration brings about ethical issues mirrored in the book. Where are these public service sites that we use? Typically, they're local nonprofits and educational institutions who engage in working with people who do not have a lot of economic privilege. Many would argue that the relationships that Johns Hopkins had with the local Baltimore community is very similar to Tulane's history of relating to New Orleans. Now, I came to Tulane and New Orleans in 1991, and I moved here from Philadelphia, and I went to college and graduate school in Atlanta. I grew up in the D.C. area, so moving to New Orleans was like moving west for me because I was such an East Coast guy. And like you, I moved here in the brutal heat. And I asked myself, what the hell have I gotten myself into? It's over 90 degrees at midnight. I pondered if I could survive here. I obviously have, and I can say each year gets better. And then back to the similarities between Johns Hopkins and Tulane's respective relationships with the communities. Those of us that have been in New Orleans for some time tend to describe things in relation to pre and post Hurricane Katrina. Pre-Katrina, a colleague described Tulane as existing in spite of New Orleans. Yes, the university was involved in many local initiatives and projects. The institution was and it still is the largest employer in the city, but the relationship between the university and the local community was often strained and racialized. Like Johns Hopkins' relationship with the local Baltimore community, ideas tended to divide around racial lines. Many white New Orleanians enjoyed the rich history that Tulane shared with the city. In contrast, many black New Orleanians did not see Tulane as a place where they were welcomed. There was a perceived mistrust between the university and its entities such as the hospital and many black and poor New Orleans residents. To illustrate, during my first year living here, I tried to engage the city by going to restaurants and participating in civic and social events in an attempt to get to know this place. The reaction to me was the most interesting that I got. People would ask me, what brought you to New Orleans? I would say work, like everybody else. Yeah, I came here to work. I said, I'm a professor. They say, oh, wow, that's cool. Do you work at Xavier? And I say, no. They say, oh, well, do you work at Dillard? I said, no. Then they started kind of puzzled. Do you work at UNO? I said, no. They were, well, where do you work? And I said, I worked at Tulane. But what hit me next was probably most interesting. I would have this puzzled look, and it really depended on the community in which I was interacting. If I was with a group of majority whites, they would say, wow, this must be a really sharp guy. If I was in a group of majority blacks, they'd say, is he a real brother? Is he a pawn of this racialized system? I'm a real brother for the fact. And sometimes the administration gets mad at that. The author of the book, Rebecca Skloot, made similar challenges in researching this book as well. She approached Henrietta's family, and they questioned her motives. They thought she was a proxy for Johns Hopkins, the hospital, and/or the university. The author traveled back and forth to Clover, Virginia, where Henrietta had spent her childhood. She would sit on the porches to talk to Henrietta's extended kin. She would leave messages for Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, on her answer machine with updates about what she had found out about Henrietta Lacks. The Lacks family had a lot of mistrust of anyone who wanted to ask about Henrietta Lacks, especially white people. Finally, the author talked to Deborah. As indicated on page 233, the author states, 10 months after our first conversation, Deborah called me. When I answered the phone, she yelled, fine, I'll talk to you. She didn't say who she was, and she didn't need to. If I'm gonna do this, you gotta promise me some things, Deborah said. First, my mother is so famous in those science history, you got to tell everybody to get her name right. She ain't no Helen Lane. And second, everybody says that Henrietta Lacks had 4 children. That ain't right. She had 5 children. My sister died, and there's no leaving her out of this book. I know you got to tell all the Lacks story, and there'll be some good and bad in that because of my brothers. You got to learn all that. I don't care. The thing I care about is you got to find out what happened to my mother and my sister, and I need to know. And then Deborah took a deep breath and laughed, and she said, get ready, girl. You got no idea what you're getting yourself into. So how does this relate to you as members of the Tulane community? Many of you are eager to engage in the local community through your public service efforts or through your scholarly endeavors. What we have to remember is that Tulane has a history in the city too. That history is good, bad, and indifferent. Local residents and people who've been here for a while may make assumptions about you and your background because you are a part of a Tulane community. People may look at you and stereotype you because you are a part of a Tulane community. This is important. This point is for all of us, regardless of our personal backgrounds. People who are not familiar with us may assume things because we are a part of Tulane. The key is to act in a similar vein as the author Rebecca did, and she similarly worked with Henrietta's family to tell Henrietta's story from the family's perspective. So this leads me to my second thing about personal responsibility as scholars, researchers, and public citizens. This point, we all have personal responsibilities. You have the personal responsibility to be a scholar. Tulane is one of the best universities in the world. You got admitted, and you can graduate. Many of you are probably at the top of your respective high school classes. Well, I'm here to tell you, welcome to a group at the top of high school classes. Tomorrow starts a new day. Again, let me tell you a story from my freshman year in college. As I said, I grew up in the D.C. area, and I met a couple of guys in my freshman English class who were from the D.C. area as well. And we were doing this sort of small talk, and they said, "Oh, where'd you go to high school?" And I told them, and they both looked at each other and said, "Wow, shoot 'em up, bang, bang." I said, "Yeah, okay. I know my high school wasn't that good." You know, that was slang about the high school I went to, and it had many challenges. There was a plethora of violence, and the school had a local reputation as being one of the worst schools in the area. The guys joking with me went to elite private schools and boarding schools in the D.C. area. I started to question, was I smart enough to be in the same classes with these guys who went to quote-unquote better schools than I did? A couple of weeks later, we got our first graded assignment back. I received an A, and the guys who joked with me received C's. I turned to them and held up my paper and said, "Shoot 'em up, bang, bang," taught me this. So regardless of the way you went to high school, you can be a star here at Tulane. You've got to work hard and balance your scholarly and professional endeavors. Now, Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, was an example of scholarly strength and endurance as well. She did not have a lot of formal education. However, she learned how to search the internet, to search for information about her mother. She was not afraid to ask questions about things she didn't know. She learned how to get power of attorney to get her sister's records and any other information she wanted about her sister from the Crownsville Hospital. Now, Deborah's tenacity in researching her family background and trying to understand scientific information associated with her mother's legacy leads me to my final thing: how the power of one cell can make a difference in scientific and non-scientific communities alike. One of the things about the class of 2015 is that you all have come of age in a time of change in the United States. Most notably, you've grown up in a world that embraces and struggles with this change. Most of you were born as the internet took over, took us into the information highway, and as Amazon.com began its relentless flow of books and everything else into our lives. Most of you were born in 1993, the first generation growing up with taking the word online for granted, and for whom crossing the digital divide has redefined research, original sources, access to information, changing the central experiences and methods to our lives. So will you make a difference? I would like to share one final anecdote, but this one is not personal. It comes from President Obama when he was running for president. Now, this is not a Democratic, a Republican, or independent commentary. It's a commentary about how one can be involved in change. Then, Senator Obama tells a story about his first visit to Greenwood, South Carolina. Months before he attended a legislative banquet, I heard South Carolina in the house. Months before he attended a legislative banquet, and he was seated next to one of the South Carolina representatives, Ann Parks. And he turned to her and said, "I need your endorsement." And he said, "Sure, I'll give you my endorsement if you come to my hometown of Greenwood, South Carolina." Now, she didn't tell Senator Obama what Greenwood, South Carolina was. She didn't say it's in the middle of nowhere. She didn't say that you can't fly there. And so the next time, the next time he went to South Carolina, he got in about midnight. It was late. He got to his hotel about 12:30 in the morning. He was exhausted. He hadn't seen his family in a few days, hadn't seen his wife in a while. He was missing his daughters. But before retiring to his room, one of his aides said, "Senator, we have a 6 a.m. trip tomorrow morning. We're going to Greenwood, South Carolina, like you promised." The next morning, he struggled to get up because he's just getting into bed. He's still tired, he's dragging, he's looking around for some coffee. We've all had those kind of days when it's hard to get moving. Some of you would have them too, but for different reasons. People in my generation have them then. I still have those days because the blood doesn't seem to circulate as fast as it used to. And I'll let you all figure out why you're going to have them. Anyway, Senator Obama, gets the paper, and the New York Times has printed a scathing article about him, which just irritated him a little bit more because he felt that some of the facts were wrong. After getting dressed, he went to meet the car, and it was raining outside, and it was one of those New Orleans rains where the rain just didn't come down from the skies. It was coming from the side and the back. His umbrella sort of blew away, and so he got soaking wet. And so, he got in the car, and he was soaked, and he's still irritated because he had to get up early. He's tired, he's all that. And he just drove and drove and drove. Like, where the hell is Greenwood? Then he finally got to Greenwood. But he hadn't realized they were in the city, because if you blinked, you would have went right past it. So they pulled inside a field near the park, and they went inside this field house. He walked in, and there were only 20 people there. It wasn't anyone's fault. He said, well, maybe this is a miscommunication between, my staff and the staff here. So he's thinking, it's 20 people. These are 20 votes I got to get. Everyone in the room looked like they were a little wet as well. They looked kind of tired as well because they were up pretty early. So he started talking to people in this small crowd. He was shaking hands and saying hello, trying to be charismatic. He was working the crowd like there were thousands of people there. Then suddenly, he hears a voice in the distance, "Fired up!" He turns around like, what's going on? He was startled, but nobody else in the crowd was. He looked around into the small crowd, and they responded, "Fired up." Then he heard the voice say, "Ready to go." And he's still a little perplexed, but the crowd responded, "Ready to go." He didn't know what was going on. Then he turned around and saw this little woman about 5'2" or 5'3". She was dressed like she was going to church. She had on her church hat, like women of a certain age do when they go to Sunday services in the South. She looks at Obama and she says, "Fired up." Her name is Edith Childs, and she was a city councilwoman in Greenwood. She is famous for her hats and her chants. Everywhere she goes, she says, "Fired up." And everybody says, "Fired up." And she says, "Ready to go." And everybody says, "Ready to go." So she came in and started chanting, "Fired up and ready to go." The small crowd is responding and getting into it. So Obama, stepped back, started watching this small woman with the church hat and how she was motivating the crowd. Then he starts getting into it. She would say, "Fired up," and he would say, "Fired up." She would say, "Ready to go." He would respond, "Ready to go." Later in the day, after that sort of thing was over, he was so motivated by the small woman with the church hat, this councilwoman Edith Childs, that he would turn to his staff and say, "Are you fired up?" They'd respond, "Fired up." He would ask, "Are you ready to go?" They'd respond, "Ready to go." So some people started putting "fired up" and "ready to go" on their T-shirts. Some people started putting "fired up" and "ready to go" on signs. Soon, the Wall Street Journal wanted to interview this woman. The Los Angeles paper said, "Who is this woman who's motivating all these people?" Then, when Oprah Winfrey went down to South Carolina, she was talking at Gamecock Stadium, which sat 30,000 people. The crowd is chanting, "Fired up, ready to go." The story goes to show you how one voice can change a room. And if one voice can change a room, it can change a city. If one voice can change a city, it can change a state. If one voice can change a state, it can change a nation. If one can change a nation, it can change the world. One voice can change the world. So if Henrietta's one cell can change a lab, it can change science. If Henrietta's story can change history, it can change us. If we, the class of 2015, and the rest of us collectively get involved, we can change a campus. Now, if we can change a campus, we can change the city. Now, if we can change the city, we can change the state. And if we can change the state, we can change the nation, and we can change the world. It doesn't matter if you are a Democrat or a Republican to effect change. It doesn't matter if you're from the North or the South or the East Coast, West Coast, or Middle America to effect change. It doesn't matter if you're a U.S. citizen or a student studying at Tulane from abroad to effect change. But you have to be fired up and ready to go. Class of 2015, are you fired up? Are you ready to go? Class of 2015, this is a good time to be at Tulane. I'm fired up and ready to go. You too can be fired up and ready to go. And if you don't know how to get fired up and ready to go, come visit me at the Center for Engaged Learning and Teaching, and we'll work with you on getting fired up and ready to go. Thank you. We have some time for questions now, too, and I think they have mics over here and here. And so if you have a question, please come to the mic. You know, tell us your name, tell us how you're going to be fired up and ready to go. All right.
I'm fired up, but I'm David Sover, and I have a question. If the Lacks family should receive any sort of compensation, where do you think it should come from?
That's a very interesting question. The question, if the Lacks family were to receive compensation, where should it come from? First, we have to think about the laws at that time. There was no law. No one broke the law at that time. So it's more of an ethical issue as well. One of the things that the author has done is set up a foundation for the Lacks family. And so the proceeds, some of the proceeds from the book is going to the Lacks family as well. And so they are getting some compensation now too. And one of the things that I've also learned by researching this book is that this book has been taught all over the place. We're not the only university who's sort of using this as a reading project. And so there are a lot of royalties that are going to that Lacks foundation to make sure that the family gets some compensation as well. And for those of you who didn't read the book, the last 2 chapters are powerful. I'm telling you, I was like, wow. I was like, it was hard for me even to fathom how someone could get into the spiritual nature of a black Southern family, get moved, and do some other things. So if you haven't read the book, at least read those last 2 chapters. It's going to blow you away. Other questions? Y'all ain't ready. Come on. Yes, come on.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Oh, this isn't nerve-wracking. Okay, I'm Shafali. I guess my question's more ethical, but for the people who are saying, like, oh, it's just cells, like, when does it, you know, you can say it's just cells and it's just organs, it's just a body. Like, where do you draw the line where people stop being just parts of science and start being human beings?
That's a very tough question. Where do we draw the line? You know, that's right, you start by being fired up. You know, currently there are no laws against that now. When we go and do any kind of procedure in a hospital and they take blood, they may take blood to sort of test us for our cholesterol or whatever, and that excess blood can be used in some of these same types of procedures today. And so if you're really concerned about these things, those are sort of the ethical questions that I think the class of 2015 is going to have to answer in terms of when do we actually stop, or where's the line between that? As the book talked about, the Supreme Court has addressed it a little bit, but there's still a lot of gray area in terms of what we can and cannot do.
Thanks. My name is Allie Earhart. I was kind of wondering, I know you touched upon the financial aspects of the book a little bit about how maybe Henrietta would have been treated a little differently had she had a little money. But I was wondering if you thought the same would be true in Elsie's case.
Would the same be true in Elsie's case? For those of you who didn't read the book, Elsie was the daughter that was in there, that was put away. I do think the thing that Elsie didn't have was an advocate. And that's one of the things that we can do as adults, is be advocates for vulnerable populations. One of the things also that sort of struck me about this book is that Henrietta Lacks took a lot. She put up with a cheating husband who cheated on her, gave her diseases, and all of that. And she still sort of had a strong sense of care for her kids and for her community. But women of that generation sort of did those kinds of things. Now, I don't think women of generations now would sort of stand for things like that. Henrietta's husband, if Henrietta's husband would have done that to her in current day, she may not have had those things. Her daughter may not have been put away for some esoteric thing that she could be treated for as well. And the ironic thing about all of this as well is that Henrietta's cells helped to find cures to many of the things that her family members ended up being diagnosed for as well. So I think part of this is some of the things wouldn't happen because I think women have more rights. Women are much more vocal. Women are over half of our first-year class. And so you're no longer sort of these quiet recipients of things as well. Women are fired up, and they're ready to go. Yes.
Hi. I'm wondering what your personal view is on a family's role for an individual or group's ability or inability to overcome poverty.
Oh, my goodness. If I could answer that, I would have won the Nobel Peace Prize. I think you can think about poverty, and I talk about this actually in some of my classes in terms of thinking about poverty in terms of a multidimensional thing. Some people thinking about, like, for example, and I hate to say this, as a student, most of you will be poor because you're students, but that's short-term poverty. You can also think about poverty in terms of chronic poverty, and poverty that lasts over generations as well. And we do know that most immigrant populations tend to come to the United States and to move out of poverty within 1 or 2 generations. But that hasn't happened for many African-American families. Many black families that were descendants of slaves tend to have intergenerational patterns of poverty. So some of it is personal, some of it is systemic. And so some of it is like, yes, I need to pull myself up and work hard, but we also need to make sure we have programs to support sort of things as well. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kara Zajac, and I wanted to ask you, how do you think the issues or conflicts surrounding the cells would have been different if Henrietta Lacks was a woman of a different racial demographic or someone of a different gender?
And I think it probably would have happened the same. I think if Henrietta was more educated, if she knew more about things, she may have tried to patent those cells. But I do think during that time period, those kind of evasive procedures happen to many people, not just poor women of color.
My name is Matt, and I was wondering, what do you think about if Johns Hopkins would be where it is today if it wasn't for Henrietta Lacks? Do you think they'd be as sophisticated?
Oh, you can ask that same question about any major university in the United States. I think it's always a hard sort of situation in terms of thinking about progress in universities that are, especially in major cities with large concentrations of poverty and urban issues. I think Johns Hopkins would have continued to progress, just like Tulane has continued to progress. There are rumors about things that happen at Tulane that people can't prove as true or not true. And so the same things happen at the University of Chicago. The same thing has happened at sort of Yale University. So at every major university, you tend to have these sort of conflicts. At the University of Pennsylvania, how much do you engage your community? At the same time, how much do you take care of the people who are on your community as well? So I think that's a question that all universities struggle with, and that universities are constantly trying to make better connections and relationships with local communities too. Yes. Okay. Yeah, we'll go here and then here.
All right. If Henrietta Lacks had, I don't know, exercised the right to keep her cells or not let them be used for science, where would the world be?
Repeat that question for me again.
Oh, was I too far? Better?
Yes.
All right. If Henrietta Lacks hadn't let her cells been taken for science, how far behind medically would we be in the world?
Yeah, the question is, if Henrietta Lacks didn't let her cells be taken for science, the thing about it is she didn't know her cells were taken. I mean, it was sort of the luck of the draw. I think there were many sort of invasive procedures that happened to many patients during that time period. And the thing that was most interesting about her cells, it was her cervical cancer cells that were doing most of the work. The healthy cells died like everything else. And so there's something about sort of a timing and place of a lot of things too. Yes.
In the same way that Locke suggested we enter a social contract with our government, don't you kind of think that we enter a medical contract with our physicians, that as doctors, they're given free rein to heal us using any means as long as it is ultimately for our betterment?
In some aspects, yes. We do sign informed consents. I mean, when you all had to get physicals to come to Tulane, and I'm sure when you got your physical, you signed informed consent about that. But the key is informed consent. And then at the same time, when you're talking about invasive procedures, how far does a physician have sort of free will to do things? And you sign those kind of things as well. Luckily, I haven't been inside of a family situation where I've had to, where I've had a physician say, wow, your mom or your family member is under this surgery, had to do certain things and had to come out and ask me something. So yes, some physicians will have to go do things to save life. What happened to Henrietta Lacks was not about them doing a procedure to save her life. They were testing it with radiation, which was the standard at that particular time. This was an aside to take her cells and to use those cells for something else.
That's fair then.
Do you think it's right for Henrietta's children, grandchildren, and so forth to claim privilege solely on their lineage to Henrietta instead of their own merits?
The question is, should Henrietta's family get because of their lineage? The issue again comes about that Henrietta had no say in terms of what happened to those cells. People were still making millions of dollars off of her cells without her knowing about it. Now, if she would have given those cells away freely, saying, yes, I want to donate my body to science, some of us may have signed on a driver's license that we're donors or something would have happened to us, that's a different sort of situation. I'm a donor, so if something happens to me and all of a sudden they find the next medical miracle out of my remains, my family should get nothing, but I made the choice of saying, yes, use my body for science. And I think we have active parts in sort of understanding what are our rights as citizens, and then what are sort of our limits also as professionals too. Yes, we can go here and then we'll go back and forth. Thank you.
Clearly, when their cells were taken, race played a factor in the family being left in the dark and Henrietta being left in the dark about her cells being taken. But do you think, as far as the compensation goes and how they were informed, race played a factor even up to present times as far as the family being left in the dark, so to speak?
We have to think about this procedure was happening at Johns Hopkins in the colored ward. And so we'd also have to go back and check the history of Johns Hopkins to see, did they have these same sort of procedures happening in the white wards as well? Was this something that was just happening in the colored wards? The book talks a little bit about the Tuskegee experiment and how in the United States, in Tuskegee, Alabama, the United States was very interested in understanding what happened with untreated syphilis. And it happened to be a group of men, black men, poor black men in Tuskegee, Alabama, who had syphilis. And so they permission to study to find out what will happen to the long-term untreatment, not that being treated with syphilis. And what happened in the middle of the study, a cure was found. And the doctors did not give these people that cure. And so that brings up the ethical situation. Especially for those of you who are going to do research here, you're going to have to fill out a human subjects form in terms of our institutional review board and do the risk outweigh the benefits. And that's a question that we all have to ask ourselves. Are the risks that we're doing in our research, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And if the benefits outweigh the risks, then sometimes we can do some risky procedures. But we have to be sure that the potential benefits will outweigh the risk. And that needs to happen regardless of our racial and ethnic background, regardless of our gender too.
Hi, I'm Matt Haggerty representing Mo9 So Fine. Does the fact that
it took me a second to get that, I'm sorry.
Does the fact that Henrietta cells have been used to cure so many diseases make it right? Like, even though that she didn't know about them taking her cells, is it still ethical since they cured so many diseases?
I mean, it wouldn't happen today. I mean, part of it, I think it's part of our history. There are a lot of things that's a part of the United States history that were not ethical, but it also made us who we are today. And so I don't think that same procedure would have happened today, but at the same time, that's a part of the history in the United States, and we have to embrace that. Just like I said, you know, we all have luggage. Some of you came here with Louis Vuitton, and I saw some people getting out cars with trash bags. We all have luggage, but, you know, but all of our luggage needs to be valued the same way. Yes.
Hi, my name is Daniel. You keep talking about how just as Henrietta's cells made a difference, our voices have the potential to make a difference. But the fact is, it was her cells that made a difference, and I'm sure that the kind of woman that Henrietta was, she would have supported making that decision. But the fact remains that if those cells had never been taken from her body by that doctor, her memory would have passed into oblivion, and that person would not have been remembered. The person who let other people sleep at the top of her stairs when they were in need, the person who never cried out in pain or asked anybody for help when she had those black marks on her chest, and she endured it all, and she was a remarkable woman. And it feels to me, do you think perhaps that she is remembered for the wrong reason, that her cells are remembered instead of the woman Henrietta Lacks and who she was?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, and I think that's also the beauty of the book. That's one of the reasons why I pulled out that quote from Deborah, and Deborah said, you have to tell the whole story. That's what Deborah said, tell the whole story about the Lacks family, not just about ourselves, the good and the bad. And it's also an empirical question, you know, where she had been known for some of those things. Then maybe the next Pulitzer Prize in the audience now. We don't know that. That's an empirical question to answer. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lee Parker. My question was, when you're taking into account the ethics of the situation, do you also take into account that A, nobody was harmed when her cells were taken? It wasn't like it was causing harm to her, and B, that it provided goodness for so many other people? Do you take that into consideration with the ethics?
Oh, definitely. I mean, she was not harmed in them taking the cells, but the issue is, as one of the questions come before, when do we have agency over our own bodies? You know, at what point can we say, I'll allow you to do an invasive procedure on me? And that's the part that's the ethical situation. It was by luck that she happened to be the person who went to Johns Hopkins, the colored ward, to have that sort of procedure done. But the ethical situation of all that comes with this notion of agency. And when do we allow people to have agency over our sort of situations as well? And some of that has to do with issues of power and control in our country. You know, she was a poor African-American woman who was also, at that time period, very quiet about what happened, too. She was quiet in the marriage. She let her husband take advantage of many things. And so when do we have agency about those things as well? And so my point is that we're a part of that change. And how can we be active participants in that and ask some of these ethical questions? As I said, I don't have all the answers. I'm hoping that you all have more questions from the book, reading the book, than answers too. We have these last two questions, and I think we have to end. Yes.
My name's Abby Watkins, and there's a portion in the book where they talk about another man who had similarly had his cells exploited by his doctor. I think they were pancreatic cells, if I remember correctly.
James Moore, yes.
Yeah, and they were patented by his doctor, actually. And the difference with his cells, I guess, is that the cells like inherently had like a medical purpose, as opposed to Henrietta's cells, although they were like medically significant in that they didn't die. Like the polio vaccine wasn't contained within her cell exactly without innovations of doctors outside of that. And my question to you is, do you believe that the same sort of ethical standards can be applied to both of those situations? Because I think that his situation is brought up in the book as a sort of parallel, but I'm not entirely sure if those are necessarily parallel situations.
Yeah, that's a very good question. In terms of looking at the parallels between James Moore's situation and Henrietta Lacks' situation. And James Moore did patent his cells, and he was able to do stuff as well. But one of the things that was so different about this as well is that the cervical cancer cells that came from Henrietta Lacks were used in all types of other experiments, and they were able to reproduce in a much more thing, but tried on these experimental sort of ways. That was quite different too. Yes.
Hello there, my name's Angela. So the book is as much about Rebecca's journey as it is about that of the Lacks family. Do you think it would have been received differently?
About whose journey, I'm sorry?
Rebecca's,
Yeah,
the author?
yeah, yes.
Do you think it would have been received differently if it were written by a woman or a person of a different race at all?
That's a very difficult question. One of the things I liked most about the book was Rebecca's sort of sincerity and honesty about it as well. And again, it was that the second to the last chapter, where I think Rebecca, and they had this sort of spiritual sort of thing happening, and Rebecca's like, whoa, what's going on here? I think that really sort of showed that Rebecca was respectful enough to tell the story from Henrietta's family's perspective. And I think that's really important as we sort of think about our work. How are we interacting with individuals? Not just, yes, we have the scholarly information that we're reading, we have theoretical foundations, but again, how can we say stuff from the participant's perspective? And remembering that all of us have a voice. It's almost like, some of your parents sort of talking for you. It's like, Mom, Dad, I can say this. We need to make sure that individuals who are part of research and when we do research, that we do research from their perspective. I think about this in my psychology work. I do quantitative psychology. And so oftentimes I'm looking at a bunch of numbers. But one of the things I have to remember is that each number represents a person's life. It's not just a number. It's representing a person's life. And so as I'm thinking about the research questions, the hypotheses that I'm addressing, I'm thinking about what is it from their perspective? Am I being respectful of how I talk about this information? Am I being respectful of how I present the information to not sort of offend that part of the community as well? All right, thank you. Are you fired up? Ready to go?